Now we're grouting. We mixed the grout. We used a non-sanded grout for the small, since we only have small things. Otherwise you would use sanded if your grout lines are bigger than 1/8 of an inch. So we're using non-sanded grout. We just take our float. This is called a tile float. And we just spread it on. You have to mix the grout to the consistency of about kind of like mayonnaise. I mix it a little bit thicker for the mosaic portion than you would for the tile portion. But this is about the consistency for that. And you just basically fill your holes and use your float to scrape off the majority of it, and the rest comes off with a sponge. But you want to do this to all your holes, all your lines, all your cracks and crevices. Really good. You got to move it back and forth over it to make sure you really fill the crack, not just get it on the surface of the crack. You want to go back and forth over it several times. Make sure the crack is fully filled. You do this to the entire thing. If you look over there, we've already done all of the... Now we're going to use a wet sponge to gently wipe all the areas that we grouted. You wipe off all the haze that's along with it. Be very gentle. We let it sit for about 10 minutes before we did this. You don't want to let it sit too much longer than that, or it'll be much harder to get up, and you're very gentle with this. If you look over here, we've already done all of the grouting of the shower. There's a haze over it, which will all be wiped off, which comes off with a dry cloth. We already did this yesterday, so that's all nice and dry. And you want to get an up close of where all our detail in our little box. We grouted everything except around the tub. Around the tub will be caulked. The grout won't stick properly to the plastic of the tub. It'll end up cracking. And we're also supposed to caulk the corners as well, but I also grout them ahead of time, and then we'll caulk them afterwards. And around the window will also be caulked, and we use a caulk that's the same color as the grout. So now we're applying our grout to the mosaic. If you see, we've done all of this. This part has already started with the grout in it. It is a process you need to use. I have thick, heavy-duty gloves on. It's easier to do this than the tile float, because on there's too many sharp edges with the tile float. But I also have the nitro gloves underneath it so that you don't get glass in your fingers as you do it, because it's still very sharp and you still need to be very, very careful with it. I just take it out by the handfuls. I'm using a much thicker mixture than what we used on the regular tile so that it sticks into all of the holes a lot better. We're using non-sanded grout because that's what we use in the tile, but I have found that the sanded grout works a lot better on the mosaics than the non-sanded grout because you have larger holes that have to be filled. But for now, we're already started with the sanded grout, so we're going to continue with that. If you see, we wiped it all on, just in a rotating motion so that you get it in all the crevices and filled in all the holes. You don't want it to just be on the surface of the holes. You want to make sure it's all completely filled. You rotate it around until it's all filled. It is a bit of a mess. It gets a lot more grout on the mosaic than it does when you're doing your regular tile work. So you do use a lot more grout than you would use on your regular based on that. Once you've done that, you continue to do it in the same way. You can see all this was done like that. Then what we do, after it's sat there for a little bit, you don't want it to sit there for more than 10 minutes or it'll get too dry, but you do want it to set a little bit. You're going to take a bucket of water, a bucket of clean water, and a large sponge, just like we did with the regular tile. You're going to carefully start wiping it off. So a lot more grout to wipe off, so you have to repeat this process many, many times. But as you see, you can see that it filled the holes. You rub it around to kind of fill in some of the little gaps that bubble up. And there may be parts that we're going to have to touch up as well if you see where this didn't get enough grout in it. With the mosaic and the glass, that's bound to happen, so we go back and we touch up those areas. But once you start doing this, you just repeat it. You can use both sides of your sponge before you rinse. You have to constantly change your water. the grout after you rinse your sponge gets dirty in the bucket and kind of defeats the purpose if you don't change your water. So you do this, and you keep doing this to the whole section, and then you'll repeat that process for the rest of it, and you'll also repeat it with a clean sponge over this at least one more time. You let it dry, and then you do what we were doing over here, and we used another sponge one more time. This has all been dried overnight. We use a clean sponge to wipe off some of this haze, and the final step is once this dries, there'll probably still be some more haze that you'll polish off with a dry cloth at that point, because at that point it's just dust that has to be polished off.